Good evening and welcome to this evening's Local History Spotlight, History in the Hollows. Before we begin, we would like to recognize that we are situated on traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Skooga Island First Nation, governed by the Williams Treaties. We are grateful to work and learn on these lands and are mindful of this treaty relationship with the Mississaugas of Skooga Island and the greater Anishinaabe Nation of which they form a part, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. I am pleased to welcome back Amanda Robinson, who's spoken with us before on a number of topics regarding the history of Oshawa. She's from the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University, where she has taught since 2013. Amanda is an Oshawa local who has spearheaded several notable public history initiatives, including walking tours for the city of Oshawa and Heritage Oshawa, to name a few. Tonight, she'll be speaking about the myth of dirty Oshawa and how it relates to a time when mills, tanneries, foundries, and factories operated near the banks of the creek in the late 18 and early 1900s. This presentation will focus on the social and environmental effects that this industrialization had on the surrounding community. If you have any questions about the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the presentation. I'll turn it over to you, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for that introduction and also the land acknowledgement that you offered at the start of the presentation. I'm very honored to be invited back to the Oshawa Public Library, and I really appreciate the space that's given for my research on a local level and the interest as well. So thank you to all of you for making it out here on this very warm June evening. I teach in the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at Ontario Tech, and some of the content I'll be presenting today is included in the courses I teach on the history of science and technology, which looks at technological adaptation and the related environmental, social, and cultural implications of rapid industrialization in Canada in the last half of the 19th century, as Nicole mentioned. What's so interesting to me about Oshawa's history is that I am part of it. I grew up in Oshawa, in South Oshawa in particular, and sort of the shadow of General Motors. And many of my extended family, friends, and immediate family were employed in the auto industry, and some of whom are either still employed in industry or are looking to be employed in industry as auto workers. So I've always been sort of interested in the industrial landscape and how it came to be in Oshawa, and also how some of the more sort of negative stereotypes associated with industrialization were dealt with in the social realm. So one of the really interesting things about Oshawa is that industrialization was celebrated as healthy because, of course, industry brought jobs and it also brought progress. You can see here as the residents of Oshawa celebrated the paving of the downtown, they hung a banner that said Oshawa, the Manchester of Canada. Of course, those associations were tied to Manchester across the pond and the robust industrial history that was there. So Oshawa was really proud of its identity as an industrial hub as part of Canada's Industrial Revolution. So some of the things that I'll touch on and explore today are topics that I integrate into my courses, and then I've also looked at as part of my graduate level research. So I wanted to offer you a critical approach to the history of industrialization. It really ties to this critical paradigm that asks what the collateral damage is of unmitigated industrialization. In the 21st century, we're familiar with the idea that industry brings environmental hazards, but residents of Oshawa in the late 19th and early 20th century were really looking to find work. And so the implications of industrialization were different from this time period to the one that we're looking at now. But we can still look at those byproducts, the collateral damage, if you will, of industrialization. It's largely related to environmental hazards. It's important to note that urban and industrial Canada, was really developed in the latter half of the 19th century and into the first decades of the 20th century, driven in large part by economic policy that sought to industrialize Canada and really make it a cohesive national unit from sea to sea. So railway as well as shipping were large parts of this. And because Oshawa was on the Great Lakes, it presented a viable opportunity for industrialization. So Oshawa really embraced that industrial identity, and the social impact of that was far reaching. And we're going to look a little bit at that today. So I'm offering a resistant reading of Oshawa. Oshawa is a place that experienced rapid industrialization, and one that also proudly grabbed the banner of Canadian nationalism in the way that they positioned their industry as serving the national growth that was part of the national policy in the immediate years after Confederation. So I look at that from the perspective of, flipping the narrative, maybe asking what stories are there that maybe aren't heard, or amplifying the ones of people who may not have had the capacity to tell a story. Those who were living and working in industrial spaces that maybe didn't have the capacity to write down their stories, whose stories may be told through oral histories or which are left in material culture in the historical record. So that might be, abandoned industrial factories and infrastructure, which we sort of see in parts of Oshawa that continue to sort of dot our landscape and remind us that at one time these spaces may have been more industrialized than they are now. So I'm offering a cultural critique of science and technology by asking about those, what is the collateral damage of science and technology and its implications in our lives, as well as asking what technological nationalism meant in visual culture at the time. So one of the other things I'm interested in is looking at how industrialization was represented and advertised as something that was good for the nation, and also what the realities of that technological nationalism looked like, which was really unfettered growth, as we'll see. So when we define urban industrial Canada in the period that we're looking at, we're really looking at economic expansion and urbanization that's highly and heavily concentrated around the Great Lakes shipping corridor. We're also looking at a more liberal attitude towards business and investment, particularly one that encourages economic growth. And we see the national policy as sort of an example of this, where there's a high tariffs that are put on products for import and export from Canada, so that it encourages regional investment and growth in industries. And that's really tied to McDonald's national policies in the first few decades after Confederation. So that gives the sort of economic context in which this takes place. I'd like to offer a sort of visual timeline before we get into some of the images that we're going to look at and analyze today as we sort of wear the hat of historians. Of course, some or all of you may be familiar with the tradition of United Empire loyalists that were part of the colonial settlement of the North Shore of Lake Ontario. Moving into industrialization, we start to see through the 1830s to the 60s, the establishment of small industries in Oshawa's Creek area. So something like the Warren Mill in the 1830s, as well as, tanneries, canneries, these types of things emerging in, creek areas because of course, water power presented a viable way to, run these operations. And then you start to see Oshawa sort of burgeon and grow, not only as a sort of smaller settlement, but an industrial mecca in the last decades of the 19th century, and particularly into the early 1920s. Many of you may be familiar with the McLaughlin Carriage Company, the precursor to the McLaughlin Motor Car Company and eventually General Motors Canada. And so those were, that meant a heavy investment in industry in Oshawa. And so that sort of situates, that Manchester of Canada moniker. It was promoted by local newspapers and publications, as well as in sort of local writings, that Oshawa was the Manchester of Canada, and it was something to be proud of, right? This is just some still shot images of Oshawa factories in 1910. Oshawa was advertising itself externally as a place of industry, and that this translated to health. Quite frankly, this was how it was looked at during the time. So the impacts of industrialization on Oshawa's waterways were far-reaching. It reconfigured how the water was used, where the water went. It also was at the mercy of seasonal floods, and it creates these circumstances where the water has its own whims, but in some ways it's being controlled and tamed according to the urges and needs of humans, right? And so this is all happening in a time of rapid technological change and social complexity, coming out of industrialization and sort of leading into the modern era in the 20th century. We're also seeing at this time reconfigurations in where people are living. The rural to urban shift where people are leaving farms and migrating to urban industrial areas in order to seek out work. So it really reconfigures not only how people work according to a modern factory system, but also where they live as they leave rural areas and often settle near factories, of course, where there's unfettered regulations on sort of pollutants. Working class people are by and large living in these areas, and they can't escape that. So it creates these physical and environmental hazards in terms of creep pollutants, respiratory issues. These are all well documented, not only in Oshawa as an industrializing space, but the larger history of industry has looked at contaminants and hazards to working class people who are forced to live in the shadows of this industry. But of course, technology is complex, and I couldn't sit and paint a picture of doom and gloom, despite the fact that the skies may have been gloomy. But what industrialization brings is also opportunity for public works and municipal development. And this is where you see that sort of double-edged sword of technology and industrialization, is it brings distinct social benefits in the midst of these hazards and this inequity among the working classes and those who own the means of production and can, of course, buy their houses or build their houses up the hill rather than, sort of down the hill where the pollutants and contaminants run. So it also leads to the situation of moral reform and regulation, which seeks to improve environmental conditions in Oshawa, in its waterways, in the midst of unfettered industrialization during this period. One of the things I like to highlight with my students, it's also part of how I've used these images as a historian and someone who thinks about how we can engage with history and how we can get people excited about our wonderful local public history resources, are these images from the Thomas Boakley collection, which are held by the Robert McLaughlin Gallery. Some of you may be familiar with, but seeing workers in context, how they looked when they were working in these mills and factories, typically impresses upon the students with whom or whom have a pretty deep disconnect from this kind of work, right? They're working with their hands, my students, but typically with their fingers on their computers and potentially working in service industries, whereas their counterparts 100 years ago or more were, working on the floors of Oshawa's factories the hollows being the name that was historically associated with Oshawa's creek valleys, and which, of course, because Oshawa is part of the Oak Ridges Moraine Basin, these are where the industries were and where the water was flowing down. So Oshawa, topographically is characterized by valleys and creeks, and we see those high points, right? And so these workers, living in these creek hollows or perhaps near them, also working in these industries. And it is usually surprising that, there were children and boys also working. And you can see here the Warren Tannery workers from 1892 included, likely working class boys that were taken on as apprentices. And also, proudly displaying their tools that they would have used to do these jobs. A counterpoint is the McLaughlin Company office staff. And if I were to ask you to analyze these images between people working in industry, you can see the fittings mechanics from the McLaughlin Motor Car Company in 1920, with sort of the dirty hands and their clothes covered with the oils and things that they're working on, versus the office staff. It gives a real sort of stark compare and contrast of their social class, quite frankly, where they were working, and the orders and the hierarchies of society at the time. Likewise, I mentioned at the top of my presentation that one of my areas of interest is comparing representations of industry in visual culture, and then taking that and comparing it to actually the ways in which technology was influencing the social and environmental conditions people were facing during Canada's Industrial Revolution. This is McLaughlin Carriage Company catalog cover from 1901, which sort of harmoniously depicts the smokestacks rising amid one of Canada's preeminent, at the time, largest carriage producers. But you'll notice that identity is situated by Britishness and not quite Canadianness. And one of the things that is so interesting about Oshawa's industrialization is you really sort of can see the track from that sort of United Empire loyalist sort of colonial allegiance to the development of Canadian nationalism in the advertising that a company like the McLaughlin Carriage Company was putting out. And this wasn't in Oshawa's hollows or Oshawa's creek flats, but it was intimately tied to Oshawa's environmental landscape. Case in point, the disastrous fire of 1901 that destroyed the McLaughlin Carriage Company was extinguished with water that was driven by Oshawa's creeks, right? So industry was intimately connected with Oshawa's hollows, both socially, but also environmentally, and it relied on it, right? It was an important resource for industry to make use of. Likewise, depictions of, rural harmony amid the sort of pristine landscape were depicted in many of the McLaughlin Carriage Company and Motor Car Company ads in the early part of the 20th century. So you'll see in some ways, taking a motor drive by the creek or near a waterway was an important way that early technology was advertised as part of environmental and social change during this period, but almost sort of just taking the car and superimposing it on a river, right? You could use this technology that was created by industrialization to better enjoy the river, right? So, that messaging was prominent, but, the reality of what technological change looked like in Oshawa, which was still at the whims of the water, it was still at the whims of the valleys and the dips in our water table. As you can see that, the flooding continued, right? Oshawa experienced seasonal flooding as it was industrializing, and it caused quite a bit of havoc. It was a hazard for people to navigate, and it also destroyed homes and also industry. Here you can see an image from 1922 with King Street West in the foreground, and you can see the Warren Mill and the Oshawa Canning Company in the photo. And you can also see people traversing in the background. So here where you have this type of development where it's a sort of mix of industrial, residential, but also you have the whims of the environment, it causes quite a bit of havoc, and it doesn't make for good business either when you have to worry about your business being flooded. Here we see a few other issues that came up with rapid technological change where there is not adaptation in a manner that supports the infrastructure that you're trying to use, or the technology that you're trying to use, if you will. The infrastructure doesn't support the technology. So we have a flipped train, as well as cars that are destroyed by seasonal water flows or ice flows. And these are taken near Oshawa's downtown or sort of on the outside limits. This is one at Harmony Road Bridge, Highway 2 in 1929. So what's so interesting is, the cultural realm and the social realm there's kind of a difference, right? The cultural realm is depicting these sort of beautiful, idyllic representations of what technology how it can help you engage with nature, see nature, view nature, versus, what was really happening when you create a technology and the infrastructure is not there to support it. But what starts to happen, and what's so interesting in the archival records that I've accessed, is that people were active agents in trying to sort of quell the winds of the creek and of the hollows. They continued to use it. It was being used for industry, but they were also using it for leisure, which we still continue to do so. So there's some continuity there. And while industry has primarily moved out of Oshawa's creek and the hollows, you still have the infrastructure that sort of remains there as a reminder of what needed to happen in order for us to sort of live in harmony, or in order for industry to live in harmony with the creek. Here you see rapid infrastructure development in the 1920s and 30s, which is also spurred on by developments in building materials and engineering design. So, in that respect, there's the double-edged sword. You also see science and technology adapting methods to manage these environmental hazards and mitigate them. And then you still have those sort of continued uses of the creek for leisure, for recreation, to live. Of course, that's something that's also a continuity, is that that's where some people's homes are. And it may not be, a physical built home. It is a place where people have scavenged and found refuge since time immemorial. So it is a really dynamic and interesting space. And you also get it sort of increasingly regulated for public health and hygiene in the 20th century. So one of the really interesting things is that Oshawa residents or Oshawa engineers had a pretty good idea that the creek around the line of industry, which was sort of downtown proper, the sort of Warren Mill area, and below that was polluted and contaminated. Scientists in the early 20th century start looking at this and they start figuring out, okay, where can we draw water from? Where is clean water? When they start to, they want to establish a more robust sewer system and water supply system for residents in the city or in the town at the time. And so then you also see, really positive developments in understanding that, access to clean water is really important, and that also, unfettered industry ultimately will lead to contamination. And you start to see policies and practices that, move away from just, unfettered dumping in the Oshawa Creek. So, there we see improvements, but on the other hand, we still see the sort of continued hazard of the creek and bridges, especially when they give way. And there's always that maintenance, right, that has to go on to maintain any infrastructure that you're adapting to it, any new technology. So, what I always say to my students, like, what are the conclusions that we can draw from when we look at the sort of cultural and social history of the Oshawa Creek is that the creek can show us how rapid the technological change was that Oshawa experienced during sort of Canada's second wave of industrialization, which happened around the time that Oshawa was industrialized. And that change is also reflective in widespread social change, right? Talk about people, moving from rural areas to urban areas or semi-urban areas like Oshawa. That was reflective of broader trends and larger histories. And although, the sort of, the dirty South Oshawa moniker is exclusive to Oshawa, Oshawa's history is similar to other places where industry has operated and where there is social class divisions based on who works in industry versus who drives industry or who funds industry, that is the owners of the means of production, versus those who are required and forced to work in those industries. Technological adaptation is hazardous, and that is what our visual record shows us. It also shows us that people were active agents in lobbying or requesting that local municipal governments make changes. One of the things that I was interested by and fascinated by is that I found that local residents were going to municipal council and asking for more bridges. They were asking the city council and the mayor to fix the problem with the floods in the Oshawa Creek Flats and the hollows. And by and large, local politicians responded to those requests and adapted the physical built environment to protect industry and also protect people's homes and their livelihoods. And that lastly, the cultural realm, that is advertisements, some of the ones I showed you, they aided in that sort of technological adaptation by communicating what that cultural change looked like in a rather harmonious way. In a contemporary advertisement, we probably wouldn't see smokestacks billowing over the local town where a factory was located, but we would see representations of technology that fit with what society values at the time. In 1916, Dr. T.E. Kaiser, who was a physician with the Provincial Board of Health, a very close friend of the McLaughlins, and someone who advocated for a change to the bylaws so that the McLaughlins could export their automobiles with a low tariff on export. He testified to town council that industry was healthy and that towns that did not have industries were dead and still. So the idea that industrialization is perhaps polluting or hazardous is something that is relatively new. Previously, it was something that was embraced. And the idea that industrialization represents sort of dirty is something that has gone through multiple changes in terms of what that means, at least in the context of Oshawa and the sort of myth of dirty South Oshawa. So that's it for my little spiel. Happy to entertain questions.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That's quite fascinating to hear the perspective from the point of view of, you see the advertising and what the idyllic nature of these industries was, and then the reality, of course. I've seen those advertisements for a lot of the industries in the area, and they often don't even represent the factory. They often make it look larger than it was. Like I look at like aerial photographs of the factories at a certain time, and then I look at advertisements from the same time, and they always mention the largest producer of whatever in the British Empire, or like peddler people, and those kinds of factories were always touting their own horn and saying that, we're the largest producer of metal built products in the British Empire. And that attachment to the colonial nature of Canada. Yeah, I'd never really thought of it that way, but that really tells you something. They were trying to model it after, the Manchester of England. Now we're in the Manchester of Canada.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to see Canadian national identity happening through the ads, because I forgot to mention it, but there was one there where they start using the maple leaf motif.
Mhm.
And they do that, I think it's like 1917, 1918. So it coincides directly with the aftermath of Vimy Ridge, and sort of Canada breaking away, symbolically, at least, not quite economically, from the British Empire, and striking out on its own, if you will. And the McLaughlin ads, just mirror that. Everything is couched in British Empire until about 1915-16, and then you see that distinct Canadian identity, and then that's kind of muddied a little bit later, because of course the U.S. GM takeover of the McLaughlin Motor Car Company, become General Motors of Canada. But then there are, in all the communications that I've read from the archives, they are at the behest of the American designers, and they're adapting a little bit to the Canadian market, but a lot of the influences from American advertising agencies in like the 1920s and 30s. So it kind of almost covers the full sweep, which is so fascinating.
Well, you mentioned I never really thought about the American influence, but if they're showing those cars, driving along a nice sunny day, river, but they weren't really showing winter in Canada with this car. So you showed like the ice flows and the flooding that happens in the spring when the ice melts, and where does the water go to? And it's, they really didn't present that part of it. And then the car getting stuck in the muck, because the roads, they didn't build the roads before they built the car.
Right, it came after, and that's hence the celebrations for just a couple blocks of paving, right, like in 1912. And then of course they're not reporting on the deaths either, right, of children and things that are sort of spike in the first applications. And also country in rural areas, people who are just kind of perturbed by the slick city folk who show up with their cars, sort of disrupting the rural harmony as well, right? Like that image of the family traveling from the farm to the city is very idyllic, but it doesn't capture the noise, right? All of the ways, the ruts that are left in the road, all of the ways that the car sort of disrupts stable ideas of sort of time, space, and social class during that period.
Mm-hmm. I know too, I'm just waiting to see if any chats come in, but a couple of questions I'll be reading while I'm going to ask you something. First off, you were mentioning the cars coming in and then the roads being paved. But of course, the Carriage Company, I remember these advertisements from the McLaughlin Carriage Company before they were producing cars. And there was that rivalry between carriage producers and car producers. And you would see them making fun of each other's industries in their advertisements, where the car ends up in the ditch, but if you have a horse and carriage, the horse can pull you out if you get stuck in the ditch. And so that's, of course, before R.S. McLaughlin convinced his father to switch over to car production.
Yeah, it's that sort of transitional adaptive advertising where they're trying to offset the influence of the car. Like 1905, 1906, the McLaughlins had these calendar covers and made a big to-do of depicting the car as dangerous, hazardous, disruptive, right? And the carriage, as you say, is the reliable thing. And I mean, even what's so interesting about the history of the automobile is that it wasn't just immediately embraced, right? Like it was there's this sort of like, it's a bit of an urban myth, but like some carriage producers and businesses stockpiled carriages for when they would make a comeback, right? That the car was this newfangled technology that didn't really have feed. It was, a novelty, but it wasn't going to last. And quickly the McLaughlins shifted that, right? As you said, in large part from influence from R.S. McLaughlin, his father, but also because they just, the writing was on the wall. They realized that it was gonna be big, and they better get on board with it. But they struggled, right, to get a reliable engine. And eventually, got caught up in the sort of monopoly amalgamation that happened with General Motors, right?
Mhm.
So they had that moment of Canadian automobile. It was short-lived, but it's in the visual imagery, you really do see those cross influences from the US and Britain, but also like the local identity. They some of those ones you mentioned, Nicole, depict like outside of Oshawa, right? Or Niagara Falls is one that comes up in 1910, 1912 with their early auto ads, where they're saying, okay, this is how you can leave the dirty smells of the city. In fact, there's one that says that, leave the smells of the city and follow along the Great White Way. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the sort of racial incantations and undertones of these advertisements as well. They were really marketed and geared towards a white audience, and in some cases also appropriated Indigenous cultures and icons as part of the way they were advertising what it meant to use technology as well.
There was a question regarding the flooding. Get a question here from Grace. She says, I was wondering how the extreme flooding in the Oshawa Creek Valley was brought under control. And she doesn't know if there's any dams in the city or north of the city proper that could adjust the flow of water. And she also wondered where the Cedardale Pond was.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you so much, Grace. So I do know that there was a spillway erected just north of Highway 2, where the Warren Mill was, which is now a parking garage on the north side of Highway 2. Just, I guess it would be west of Kaiser McMillan. I think McMillan, maybe that area. And so there was efforts to control that flow through the spillway. And then of course the various points of industry. There was some activity downtown Oshawa and then also in the Mill Street area, which is, off Simcoe between like Bloor and Olive. I'm not sure how familiar you are, and I should have had a map. I apologize for not having that. And then also then in Cedardale, which and in addition, that's just on the Oshawa Creek. There were other industrial activities and other, there was the Harmony Creek and a few others as well that feed down. But Cedardale was the sort of southernmost industrial section. It wasn't considered part of Oshawa until it was annexed. And I think that happened in about the 1920s. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Nicole. But that was considered its own sort of a hamlet. And it was just south of Bloor Street, west of Simcoe Street. So there still are some of the sort of, if you go down to this Central Lake Conservation Authority, which is actually housed in the old Robson Leather Tannery, which was sort of the center point of Cedardale's industries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And Cedardale was such an interesting little sort of hamlet because it had also a pond, right? My understanding is that the pond was not naturally occurring. It was flooded as part of the industrial activities. And there was, in fact, a dam at Cedardale. And there's some great images in the Thomas Buckley collection or Buckley collection archive of the breaking point of the dam. The dam was flooded out. So they were trying to do some damming, but of course, hold it back, right? If they get a big surge of water that comes down from the Oak Ridges, down one of those valleys that I was talking about, it is a drainage basin, right? So yeah, those could be wiped out, and they were. And those pop up in the photographic record as well. People were interested in that kind of stuff. They like to take pictures of disasters.
Nothing changes, right? People like to stop for accidents. You'd like to see bad things that go wrong.
Eyeballers. They save all their pictures for when something goes wrong, for sure.
There's another question here from Walter. Says the industrialization of Oshawa also brought with it a large influx of immigration. What is the cultural impact or the impact of the cultural character of Oshawa? Because of course we had a lot of workers coming over and working in those factories, specifically a lot of Eastern European.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've taken a look at that from a social perspective.
Of course. And so you would have certain groups of immigrants concentrating, in some industries. I think of Polish immediately, Ukrainian, right? In fact, some of our pavilions sort of reflect Oshawa's really rich history of immigration, and our industrial revolution was in large part human powered by various immigrant groups. So typically you sometimes hear of certain groups being associated with certain industries. I know for some town like Welland, the Welland Canal, for example, was built predominantly by Irish immigrants. But in Oshawa in particular, and I feel like it was Ukrainian or predominantly Ukrainian or Polish in Cedardale. I've had someone say that to me just in an oral history, but Nicole might be better suited to answer that question.
I know that predominantly around the Cedardale area, or Bloor and Simcoe area, and between Bloor and Simcoe and Bloor and Ritson, there were a lot of cultural centers. Like there was the Ukrainian churches are both there, both the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Ukrainian churches are there on Bloor Street or just north of Bloor. And people who contact me about researching their family in the area almost always are centered in that corridor and a little further south as well. I think you start to see a lot of, if you looked at the Canadian census, and I'd have to take a look, I don't know the specifics, but the Canadian census, let's say from 1901 to 1911 to 1921, now those are all publicly available, and you can access them through the library with ancestry.com. But you could take a look and see where people's country of origin was, because the census records do list the place of birth of people. And I believe the Oshawa Museum has done more of a study on this, and you might want to consult their website, because they often have blog posts about little aspects of Oshawa history. And I think they did just do something on the cultural makeup of the city at the time when it became a city in 1924. So I think you were still seeing at that time, though, like mainly talk about being proud of being from the British Isles. So you had Scottish and English, a little less Irish in the city. I think it was mainly more Scottish from what I understand. And then it became in the 20s and further on predominantly, or becoming more and more populated with people from lots of different places. So, making sure that the multiculturalism was alive and well back then as well. We don't really think about talking about going back into the papers and looking at contemporary resources. Oftentimes we're asking questions that they didn't think to give us notations on in the record. It's like we wanted to know how many people from these places where there were, and there's nothing really spelled out in that way. They weren't questions they were asking when you're looking at city reports and demographics and things like that. So that's why the federal census would be a place to look. So, but I think the Oshawa Museum does have resources on that as well.
That's a good question too. I gave a version of this tour as a public walking tour. And I did have some people come to speak with me who were from Cedardale. And I grew up not far from Cedardale, like the Conant area. The Conants were a sort of wealthy Oshawa family that donated some land and eventually I grew up in sort of a 1950s house that was built for a GM worker. And I know that because of the directories, so I looked them up. But one of the stories that came out of that was also the intense discrimination that certain groups faced, even from places like Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, which is where Canada's immigrant pool was coming from in the sort of, as Nicole mentioned, the 1920s and 30s, in large part because, I use emphatic air quotes, that sort of preferred groups were Northern European. They had been exhausted and they really weren't coming anymore from Britain and Sweden and those types of Icelandic Nordic countries like they were coming earlier. So I did get some background from people who would tell me about the discriminatory and prejudicial attitudes they would face being from not only South Oshawa but Cedardale, but from specific ethnic communities as well. So there was some tension there as part of this. And then also I think about the social implications of being a new immigrant who had no occupational health and safety protections during this time as well, and who maybe didn't speak the language or who didn't have mutual aid. And that's where you see immigrants clustering in communities where they can speak their language and their traditions are preserved as well. And then, what the byproduct of that is our wonderful cultural pavilions in Oshawa, which are such a gem, right? And they kind of preserve those ethnic identities as they were as part of that early industrial history, which I think is really cool.
There's a question related to that. At the time, would Oshawa have been considered one of the more wealthy cities in Ontario due to the industrialization? I know we always have that stigma where we're industrial, so therefore the people who made the money from the factories didn't live in Oshawa, right? So, but we weren't considered a wealthy city, even though we were making a lot of the products.
It's a great question, and it's got a few answers. Nicole mentioned the census. So the census schedules from, I think, 1871 actually show, and also from the can't remember the year, but it was like the Royal Commission on Labor that also was interviewing workers in these industries as well to sort of collect data on how dirty they were, how hazardous they were, right, as part of building safety protections for workers and labor laws in the early part of the 19th century or 20th century. And so what the 1871 report shows is that actually Oshawa workers had a high level of skill, at least in the 1870s, and were paid fairly well for the work that they did. There was industries in Oshawa. I mean, this was really before the McLaughlin Carriage Company took off at all. It was like in its infancy in the 1870s and 1880s. It was kind of an upstart, sort of small carriage business among many. But the other industries, woodworking, the piano factory, right? Actually, workers were paid comparatively well. And of course, it depended on the industry. If the worker was skilled. But then increasingly, what you start to see, in a place like the McLaughlin Carriage Company, they were doing quite well, and by all accounts, were also treating their workers quite well. These are sort of the stories that come out, and there was a sense of pride and identity in working for something like the McLaughlin Carriage Company around the turn of the century. Especially when it's got these sort of grandiose images and advertisements that they're putting out there, and it is bringing in wealth, right? And certainly there was a boom for Oshawa. Now, you have to look at it in the larger context of the economic policies and flows of trade that are happening nationally. But yeah, relatively speaking, in particular, the Carriage Company didn't make Oshawa. It was already doing quite well before it came on the scene, but it certainly provided a big boost for the economy, and that continued to grow. And what ends up happening is the application of scientific management in the factory system, which moves away from a more sort of artisan-based type of production to one person puts this bolt in, then it goes down the line, right? Factory line style. And what you see is then the Canadian labor movement, comes up, and you have a fight for better wages and more wage parity and equality in the 30s and the 40s, to the point that at least auto workers in Oshawa, and they're kind of setting the bar for some of the other industries, we're doing quite well, and you start to see that sort of post-war, in particular, we're going now into the 50s, post-war boom economically in Oshawa, to the point where it grows into quite the workforce by the 1980s. And then, as we know, there's a whole other story for the other half of the 20th century that we won't get into.
A question here from Walter. The formation and growth of Oshawa as an industrial center undoubtedly displaced the local Indigenous people that used to live there. And he's just wondering if there's any research into the effect on the local Indigenous population that the industries had.
Yeah, so one of the, I guess I would say it's overlooked, is the extent to which European colonizers built on pre-existing Indigenous trade routes and and pathways, if you will. This idea that this was this untamed wilderness when European colonists or settlers arrived is, it's a myth, right? And so, yeah, certainly Indigenous people have been here since time immemorial, hunting, foraging, living, building communities, moving, right? We know that some of these groups were nomadic. But yeah, these were their, Oshawa in particular, the whole Skooga carrying place was the place that they lived off of. And it didn't mean that necessarily that they built a brick house to say this is ours, right? So that imposition of the capitalist style of land ownership was incredibly displacing for Indigenous peoples. And, local history resources document this, right? Like something like the Peddler Papers, right? Which document moments in history where settlers came into contact with Indigenous peoples who were, exercising their rights, their treaty rights, and also just the right to exist. And at times it caused conflict. I know that there's a story, I think it was one of the early Conan settlers, not Conan, yeah, Thomas Conan, I think, getting into altercations with Indigenous peoples at what is now Lakeview Park, or Lake Ontario shore, over animals and over their hunting, right? And that sort of threat that colonists felt when they came into contact with Indigenous peoples, because of course, they were there to settle and take the land, right? And that's a very complicated history, but one, it's certainly important to acknowledge and recognize that, yes, this industrialization resulted in the displacement and also the contamination of lands that Indigenous peoples have lived on and were living on at the time.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Skooga carrying place and the trading routes, which were well established, and the settlers coming in just took advantage of those. It was natural pathways that were formed over millennia from the Indigenous people, going from the mouth of Lake Ontario up to Skooga, right? So there was that.
And then just getting that knowledge too, right? Because of course, that history of natives or Indigenous peoples and newcomers is one of contestation, but it's also one of cooperation and mutual aid at points, right? Where they're Indigenous people are sharing their knowledge, right? And that is another thing that settlers benefit from, is knowledge of the land, the topography, various species, their properties, and that's a longer history. And also to tie to the national narrative, how can you ever get away from the fact that the industrial settlement is intrinsically tied to the project that is Canada, right? And the building of Canada as an industrialized nation. So it reverberates locally, but also regionally and nationally as well.
Oh, someone's just asking about the where the pathways ran in terms of Oshawa today. That would be the old Skoogog. What was referred to as the Non-Quan Road, I believe.
Yeah. So interestingly, the Peddler Papers, Samuel Peddler Papers, seem to sort of capture some of those early trade routes, just sort of verbally. There's a really excellent book. It's called The Skooga Carrying Place, A Frontier Pathway, by Grant, I think it's Karshish. I don't know if I'm mispronouncing his last
name. Grant Karsich, yes. I'll put it in the chat.
And that would be an excellent one. Yeah, I see Kirsten's added that there. Much more comprehensive sort of topographical environmental history of Skooga Carrying Place trails, and also like a much more detailed account of how Indigenous peoples have been displaced by the application of European settlement and colonization and industrial practices. Excellent book. I refer to it frequently, and super knowledgeable author as well.
And local author.
And local.
Okay, thank you so much for posting that, Kristen. For the link, you beat me to it. That was great. It is a book that I've referred to many times as well. And Grant was doing, Grant Karsich, the author, did research in our library, often bringing films in from the provincial and federal archives to document that. So he's very knowledgeable about that. And the previous, used to be on our library board for many years. He's a board member of the library. So he's very much intertwined with the history of the Oshawa historical community.
Yeah, and very also there's quite a bit in there about manufacturing and industrialization as well, and the sort of intersections of those activities on the Oshawa Creek. Yeah, he had questions for me at a walking tour once, and I thought these questions are probably better answered by you than they are of me. Quite remarkable on the topic, and the book is fascinating.
Mm-hmm. So the copy of the book, they put a link there too. You can purchase a copy, but of course the Oshawa Library also has a copy available. If you'd like to borrow it, you can search for Skooga Carrying Place in the Oshawa Library catalog. Well, I think those are the questions we have in the chat. I think we're coming up to just before 7 o'clock. I wasn't sure if there's any other questions or any closing things that people wanted to ask. If anybody's not comfortable with the chat, if they wanted to just unmute themselves and ask a question, you're welcome to do so. Okay. Perhaps no one does, or all the questions have been who've been asked and answered. Anyone who's curious, I have recorded this session, and it will be placed on our YouTube channel within a few days. And so you'll be able to, I'll be sending out a link to that, and you can just observe all of our other guest speakers that we've had on different topics of Oshawa's history. So I'd like to thank you to Amanda for joining us this evening and sharing her wealth of knowledge on the history of industrialization in Oshawa and so many other things. And thank you all for watching and attending this program this evening. Our next local history spotlight will be on August 26th, where the topic will be murder and mayhem in Oshawa's past. Oshawa has some shady stories in its history, from murders and duels to robberies and arson. Find out about our dark past with historian Alicia Bertrand. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And that concludes our presentation.
Thanks so much, everyone, for making it out. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.